How Fascism Works, the Politics of Us and Them is a powerful and sobering examination of how fascist ideology takes root and flourishes in societies. In clear, accessible language, philosopher Jason Stanley breaks down the tactics used by fascist leaders to divide populations, stoking fear, creating a mythical past, undermining truth, and labeling certain groups as enemies. By exploring historical and contemporary examples, the book reveals how democratic societies can slide into authoritarianism when people are persuaded to view their fellow citizens as threats. It is both a warning and a call to stay vigilant in protecting truth, equality, and justice. About the author. Jason Stanley is a professor of philosophy at Yale University, specializing in political philosophy, propaganda, and the role of ideology in shaping public thought. Born in the U.S. to parents who escaped Nazi Germany, his academic work is deeply informed by a personal connection to the themes he explores. Stanley is widely respected for blending rigorous scholarship with urgent, real-world relevance. His writing bridges the gap between academic insight and civic awareness, offering readers a clear-eyed view of the mechanisms that threaten democracy from within. In a quiet land where people once believed they were safe from the darkness of the past, a strange fog began to drift in. It wasn't sudden or loud, but soft, creeping, and almost invisible at first. People didn't notice it right away. They went about their lives trusting that the world was still steady beneath their feet. But something was changing. At first, it was the way people spoke about their country. Voices began to rise, praising a golden age that had long since faded, painting a past that was simpler, purer, and stronger. This past wasn't necessarily real, but it was beautiful in its illusion, untouched by conflict, free of outsiders, and ruled by a single, unquestioned identity. People found comfort in it, even as the present felt uncertain and filled with complexity. Then came the talk of us and them. It didn't start with shouting. It started with suspicion. Neighbors began to look at each other with narrowed eyes. Some people were no longer seen as truly belonging. They were born here, they worked here, but somehow they were now strangers. The fog thickened every time someone spoke of national purity, of protecting the homeland, of reclaiming something that had supposedly been taken away. This story had been told before, in other lands and in other times. The philosopher who watched this unfolding from a distance recognized the signs. He had studied the history of how democracies can slowly bend, how fear can be stirred like a fire, and how the truth can be reshaped until people no longer recognize it. He knew that fascism didn't always march in wearing a uniform. Sometimes it slipped in quietly, through language, through nostalgia, and through division. In the land covered by fog, people began to question what was real. Trusted sources of information were under attack. Journalists were accused of being traitors. Intellectuals were called enemies. And scientists were dismissed if their findings didn't support the official narrative. Confusion spread, and in the confusion, fear found fertile soil. It wasn't just fear of violence or poverty. It was fear of losing identity. Fear of being left behind in a fast-changing world. Fear that the country was being stolen, that the traditions were being erased. And so the people welcomed strong voices that promised to restore order, to protect their culture, and to punish those who had supposedly betrayed them. The philosopher sighed, not with bitterness but with sorrow. He had seen how these promises could seduce even good-hearted people. Fascism didn't begin with hatred. It began with desire. They desire to feel safe, the desire to belong. They desire to be told that your pain has a cause and that someone else is to blame. As the fog grew thicker, people were encouraged to believe in a simple story. It was the story of a nation under siege, a righteous people surrounded by enemies. They were told that morality was weakness, that compromise was betrayal, and that unity meant obedience. The more the people embraced this story, the more divided they became. The philosopher knew that one of the most powerful tools of this creeping darkness was the destruction of truth. When the truth becomes blurred, people no longer know whom to trust. They become isolated, suspicious, and more likely to seek refuge in strong, unquestionable leadership. If everyone is lying, then only the loudest voice matters. In this land, that loud voice grew louder. It claimed to speak for the real people, the true citizens. It dismissed dissent as disloyalty. It used humor to disguise cruelty, and strength to justify injustice. And slowly, the institutions that held the country together, courts, schools, the press, began to tremble. But still, not everyone saw the danger. Some were simply tired, weary of political debates and constant tension. Others had been so deeply hurt by the world that they clung to anything that offered clarity. The philosopher didn't blame them, he understood their longing. But he also knew that fascism thrives when people stop asking questions. And so he walked through the fog, hoping that some would listen not to him, but to history. For history, after all, had warned them. It had whispered stories of other lands that had fallen into this trap. Lands where people cheered as their freedoms were taken away, one by one, in the name of protection. The philosopher believed that the light of reason could still shine through, that empathy, courage, and memory could still guide people back to themselves. But for now he watched as the fog continued to settle across the land, soft, silent, and full of old shadows. As the fog deepened, the voices that once spoke of freedom grew quieter, not because people had stopped believing in it, but because they were unsure of what it now meant. Freedom, it seemed, had been redefined. It no longer belonged to everyone. It was now a reward for loyalty, a gift granted to those who followed the rules of the new story. In this shifting world, truth was no longer a shared language. Instead, it had become a battlefield. The philosopher watched as facts were bent and reshaped, not to deceive outright, but to create doubt. Where once there had been clear skies, now there were storms of misinformation. When people no longer agreed on what was real, it became easy to manipulate what they feared. He noticed something else, too. The people were being taught to distrust compassion. Kindness was now seen as weakness. Helping the vulnerable was mocked as a naive act, or worse, a betrayal of one's own kind. In this new way of thinking, only strength mattered, only domination, only the power to crush, not to uplift. The storyteller behind the curtain, the one crafting this new world, understood something deeply. Fear makes people obedient. So fear was carefully nurtured, like a fire fed with dry wood. The fear of the outsider, the immigrant, the neighbor who prayed differently, the teacher who challenged traditional ideas. These were all woven into a single enemy, one that threatened the myth of purity. This purity was not about reality. It was about the fantasy of a people who were once powerful, now Humbled, the storyteller gave them someone to blame. And blame, once it finds a target, grows like ivy. It climbs into every corner of the mind, wrapping around reason, tightening its grip. And so people began to look at the world through the lens of us and them. They began to believe that they were victims, that the world had conspired against them. They were told that their traditions were under attack, that their values were being erased, and that only one man, one party, one voice could save them. The philosopher remembered how fascism had risen in other times. Always it began with stories of victimhood and betrayal. Always it painted a picture of national decline caused by traitors within. The heroes were always strong, masculine, unwavering. The villains were those who questioned, who doubted, who asked too many questions. Intellectuals, journalists, activists, artists. He saw how this new story taught people to look back with longing instead of forward with hope. The past was made into a golden idol, untouched by injustice or complexity. The future was a shadow, something to be feared. And in this space between fear and fantasy, fascism found its home. The philosopher watched schools change. Education became less about inquiry and more about obedience. Teachers were pressured to avoid uncomfortable truths. History was rewritten, not to reflect what had happened, but to serve what the present power needed it to mean. If the past could be rewritten, then the people could be reshaped. Language, too, began to shift. Words like patriot were given new definitions. Freedom was no longer universal. Even the word truth lost its power, replaced by phrases like alternative facts or fake news. When the meaning of words is distorted, the meaning of justice and morality begins to erode as well. In the towns and cities, the philosopher noticed how violence crept in, not always with guns, but with silence. Silence when someone was insulted for being different. Silence when laws were passed to limit rights. Silence when the line between law and power became blurred. Silence was not always complicity, but it often was a sign of fear. And fear, once planted, spread quickly. People began to watch what they said. Some withdrew from political life altogether. Others convinced themselves that what was happening wasn't so bad, that it was just temporary, that it couldn't happen here. But the philosopher knew that fascism doesn't come like a tidal wave. It comes like a tide slowly pulling at the shore until the ground disappears beneath your feet. And those who notice it often feel alone, as if their warnings are just whispers in the wind. Still, he did not give up, for he believed that even in the darkest parts of history, there were always those who lit candles, who passed down stories of resistance, who protected truth like a sacred flame. They were not always powerful, but they were brave. And sometimes bravery begins with simply seeing clearly. The fog had grown thick, and the fire of fear burned hot beneath it. But in quiet corners of the land, some had begun to ask questions again. Some had begun to remember that freedom is not given, it is earned and defended, especially in times when the fog tries to hide the path. And the philosopher, walking through the mist with quiet footsteps, knew that this was only the beginning. The story was not yet over. As the days passed, the philosopher wandered deeper into the story, unfolding around him, tracing the threads of fear and power that had begun to weave their way into everyday life. It wasn't just in speeches or grand displays of authority, it was in whispers, in glances, in the subtle ways people changed how they behaved. People were adjusting to a world where loyalty was prized more than integrity, and obedience was safer than truth. There was something else stirring in the air: resentment. It crept in quietly, cloaked in the language of fairness and pride. Many began to speak of the world being taken away from them. They felt they were losing ground, not just economically, but morally and culturally. The storyteller behind the curtain had encouraged this feeling, fanning it gently like an ember until it caught. Soon, those who had long held power began to imagine themselves as the oppressed. It was a strange shift. Even those who benefited from long-standing systems of advantage now spoke as if they were under siege. The philosopher had seen this before: how fascist movements often flipped reality on its head. The dominant group played the victim, while the truly marginalized were painted as aggressors. This narrative of persecution made it easier to justify cruelty. If one believed they were being attacked, any action, no matter how harsh, could be seen as self-defense. That was the most dangerous illusion of all. People weren't harming others because they were evil. They were doing it because they believed they were protecting something sacred. And belief, once shaped by fear and pride, could justify almost anything. He wandered through schools and heard students being taught a very selective history. He stood quietly in churches and temples where sermons hinted that only certain kinds of people were real citizens. He sat in small cafes where laughter had turned bitter and compassion had been replaced with suspicion. He listened, he watched, and he understood. The storyteller had taken one of the oldest tools in the box division and sharpened it until it gleamed like a knife. Us versus them was no longer just a feeling. It had become a rule of life. People had begun to categorize others quickly and without thought. Loyal or disloyal, real or fake, one of us or one of them. In this world of division, the philosopher noticed how masculinity was reimagined. It wasn't about patience or wisdom anymore. It was about dominance. Strength was measured in how loud one could shout, how many enemies one could make, how deeply one could shame the weak. The storyteller praised these traits, turning them into symbols of national pride. Women, too, were given roles in the story, but theirs were narrower. They were told to return to tradition, to nurture the home, to step back from public life. Their voices, when raised in protest, were dismissed or ridiculed. The philosopher recognized this tactic one that sought to shrink power by limiting who could speak and be heard. He also noticed how language changed again. Journalists became enemies. Truth-tellers were seen as traitors. The very people who once held the powerful accountable were now accused of destroying the country. And with every accusation, more people turned away from inconvenient truths, retreating instead into the comfort of stories that affirmed their fears and biases. The philosopher walked among the people, and he could feel the tension rise. It was not yet the kind that explodes into chaos. It was more like pressure building slowly behind a dam silent, powerful and invisible to those who no longer looked closely. But there were still sparks of resistance. In some corners, students asked bold questions. Some teachers dared to tell full histories. Some journalists, though threatened and cast out, continued to write, even if only a few still read their words. It wasn't loud or triumphant, but it was their quiet flickers of courage that refused to be extinguished. He thought about the power of memory, of how remembering what once was is sometimes the strongest defense against what might be. So he began to collect stories not just of those who followed the tide, but of those who stood still while others rushed past. Those who said no when yes would have been safer. Those who reached out a hand when turning away would have gone unnoticed. He knew that fascism doesn't require everyone to believe. It only needs enough people to stop resisting. Enough people to say, "It's not my problem." Enough to look the other way. Enough to choose silence over discomfort. And so he continued walking, listening, and gently reminding whoever would hear that the line between justice and cruelty is not drawn by laws, but by people, by choices, by courage. The story was still being written. And though the storyteller behind the curtain was clever, the philosopher believed that there were always other storytellers, those who whispered truths, who painted better futures, who reminded people that democracy is not a place you arrive at, but a path you choose again and again, even when the night is long and the fog is thick. As the philosopher continued his journey, he noticed something even more troubling than anger or fear. It was confusion. People were beginning to lose their grip on what was true and what wasn't. Conversations became tangled. Facts blurred into rumors. Reality shifted depending on who was speaking. It wasn't that people stopped caring about the truth. It was that they no longer knew where to find it. This was no accident. The storyteller had been quietly working on this for a long time. He knew that the easiest way to control people wasn't through force alone, it was through doubt. If he could flood the world with enough noise, enough contradictory messages, then truth would become just one more opinion. And in a world where nothing can be trusted, people will cling to the voice that makes them feel safest. The philosopher remembered how the storyteller had attacked the press, mocked scientists, dismissed experts, and twisted language until even simple words lost their meaning. Freedom became permission to dominate. Security became justification for cruelty. Loyalty became blind obedience. These weren't just changes in vocabulary. They were changes in thought itself. And as truth became slippery, the storyteller filled the void with myths. Glorious tales of a perfect past of honor, purity, strength, and unity. These stories were comforting, even if they weren't real. They made people feel like they belonged to something greater, something noble. But hidden within these myths was poison, the belief that those outside the story, those who looked different or believed differently, were threats to that imagined golden age. People who questioned the myths were cast as traitors. Those who pointed out contradictions were accused of weakening the nation. And soon, many stopped questioning altogether. They began to repeat the storyteller's words, not because they believed them fully, but because it was easier than standing alone in doubt. The philosopher saw how this confusion bled into every part of life. Teachers grew cautious, unsure of what they were allowed to say. Artists and performers found their work censored or condemned if it challenged the approved narrative. Even families fell into silence, afraid to speak too freely around their own dinner tables. It was as if the air itself had grown heavy, thick with unspoken fear. But this was the goal. When people become disoriented, they reach for the nearest hand to guide them, even if it's the hand of the one who led them into darkness. The storyteller counted on this. He didn't need to be believed absolutely. He just needed to be the loudest, the most consistent, the most emotionally satisfying voice in the room. And he was clever. He disguised his control as protection. He claimed to speak for the ordinary people, to stand against the elites, even as he built his own power in secret. He framed every opponent as a liar or danger. Every mistake was blamed on outsiders. Every criticism became an attack on the nation itself. Slowly the storyteller's face became the face of the country. To question him was to question home, tradition, safety. The philosopher watched as the people were pulled into two worlds, one made of reason and memory, and another built on illusion and emotion. The second was easier. It asked less of them. It let them feel powerful without requiring understanding. But it came at a cost, and yet not everyone had surrendered to the fog. Some had begun to resist, not loudly or with grand gestures, but in small, meaningful ways. A librarian quietly saved books that were being removed. A neighbor stood by a family under attack. A student wrote truth into a poem and hid it in a crack in the wall. The philosopher cherished these moments, for they reminded him that confusion could be fought not just with facts, but with clarity of purpose. He also remembered that history had warned of this. He thought of times and places where truth had been destroyed, where lies became law, where people disappeared into the silence. But he also remembered the ones who had stood up even when the odds were against them, the ones who held on to reality with trembling hands, knowing that the moment they let go, the storyteller would win. So he began to speak more boldly, not with anger, but with calm, not with threats, but with questions. He reminded those who would listen that truth is not a luxury. It is the ground we stand on. Without it, we are always falling. He knew that waking people from illusion was not easy. It could not be done with shouting or shame. It had to be done with patience, with stories that were true, with examples that glowed quietly in the dark. And he knew that even those who seemed lost in confusion might one day return to clarity if someone was there to guide them back. In the stillness of evening, the philosopher looked out at a world split in two. One half lived in the comfort of untruth. The other struggled beneath the weight of honesty. But he believed that truth, though quieter and harder, always held more light. And he would keep walking, keep speaking, keep listening, because he knew that even in the deepest fog, a single voice of clarity could light the way. As the philosopher wandered further, he came to a place that looked peaceful. On the surface, streets were clean. The people were orderly, and flags fluttered proudly from every post. But when he listened closely, he could hear the tension that lived beneath the silence. It hummed like an invisible wire stretched too tight. People walked with measured steps, eyes lowered, words carefully chosen. It was not peace, it was pressure. He knew then that the final trick of the storyteller was not just confusion or fear, it was submission. By now, many had come to accept the way things were, not because they truly agreed, but because they were tired. Tired of fighting, tired of hoping, tired of the cold stares and subtle punishments. When people grow weary enough, even injustice can start to feel normal. But the philosopher also noticed something else, something far more important. Scattered across that quiet, fearful land were people who hadn't given up. They weren't shouting or rioting. They were doing something much harder. They were staying human. There was a baker who refused to stop giving bread to a banned family. There was a teacher who found clever ways to teach history without getting caught. There was a woman who painted murals of unity and love in hidden corners of the city. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were simply following something deep inside that refused to be extinguished. The storyteller in his speeches and stories always spoke of strength. He praised loyalty, obedience, and tradition, but he had no real room for compassion, no interest in complexity. His world was one of black and white, of enemies and allies. Yet in the cracks of that rigid world, the philosopher found color, softness, and courage. He came to understand that the most dangerous thing the storyteller had done was teach people to see each other as tools or threats. Once that line was drawn, once you believed that some people mattered more than others, everything else could follow. Injustice could be excused. Violence could be justified. Entire groups could be erased from memory, and it would all seem like order. But the philosopher also knew that remembering the full humanity of others was an act of rebellion in such times. To offer empathy, to ask questions, to protect the vulnerable, these were not small things. They were seeds, and seeds could grow even in poisoned soil. He began telling stories of those who had resisted before, of poets who wrote truth into forbidden verses, of neighbors who hid strangers in attics, of lawyers who defended the innocent, even when it cost them everything. These stories weren't perfect or grand. They were real, and in their honesty they gave people something the storyteller could never offer: dignity. Because in the end, fascism is not just about leaders or slogans. It's about a slow unraveling of the ties that connect us. It asks us to abandon kindness for certainty, to trade freedom for comfort, and to silence the voice that whispers, "This isn't right." But as long as someone is still listening to that voice, as long as even one person still chooses to see clearly, then all is not lost. The philosopher knew the road ahead would be long. He knew that truth might still be shouted down, that many would continue to sleepwalk through fear. But he also knew something else. He knew that people are not born to hate. They are taught. And if they can be taught to hate, they can be taught to care. So he kept walking through towns and cities, through lonely forests and crowded markets. He carried no banner, wore no uniform. He carried only stories, true stories, stories of what happens when we forget our shared humanity, and stories of what happens when we remember. He spoke softly but steadily, knowing that someone somewhere was always listening. And for every mind awakened, for every heart stirred back to life, the spell of the storyteller weakened. Because even when fear reigns, even when truth is hidden, even when cruelty is law, there is always a choice to see through the lies, a choice to reach across the walls, a choice to be brave, even if only in whispers. And that, he believed, was the greatest power of all. Thank you for joining us on this quiet journey through powerful ideas. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, consider subscribing to Mindful Reads. We share gentle, thoughtful book summaries that speak to the heart, one peaceful moment at a time.